This is All Sides from WOSU News on 89.7 FM NPR News. I'm Mike Thompson. For decades, AM radio was the only way to get news, music, and other entertainment into your home or to your car. You know, the fireside chats, radio dramas. Then came FM. Then came iPods, iPhones, satellite radio, streaming audio, and AM radio lost its cachet. Listening started to dwindle. Now, automakers want to stop putting AM radios in new cars. But AM radio still has a place. It's the home of conservative talk, some sports, even some non-English language programs. It's an important tool for emergency alerts. This hour, we're going to look at the future of the AM band and how long it will last. Automakers, including BMW and Tesla, have already begun removing AM radio from electric vehicles. They claim it into the batteries and the electrical system interferes with the AM signal. Ford announced that even new regular combustion engine vehicles would not come with an AM radio, but Ford reversed that decision after it got a lot of heat from lawmakers. And lawmakers continue to hold hearings and to discuss ways to protect AM radio in cars. And joining us to discuss this and the history of the AM band is Noah Arceneaux. He's a radio historian and professor of media studies at San Diego State University. Welcome to All Sides, Noah.
Hello. I'm tempted to say good morning, but I imagine people might be listening to this in a different time zone or streaming on a podcast.
Yes,
but
we have joined the 21st century. Yeah. We do offer this show on a podcast, but it is still morning here in Ohio, and
it's morning here. I'm in Louisiana right now.
Oh, you're in Louisiana, okay, not San Diego.
Professor Arceneaux. I've been studying radio history for a long time. I did a dissertation about department store radio stations, which was a phenomenon in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And I don't study the current stuff super in detail, but I'm generally aware of what's going on. And I was aware of this decision to try and start phasing out AM radio, which I think is a terrible idea. Let me say that. I like old stuff.
Yeah.
Old records, old music, old comic books, and I like old technology because sometimes I think it works best.
Let's start with the technology. For those who are unfamiliar, and people always ask me, what's the difference between AM and FM? And what I always say is, FM is like an airport runway. It's really wide. You can fit a lot of stuff onto that runway. So music sounds better. You can put stereo in there. You can put high fidelity stuff in there. So that's FM. AM is a two-lane highway that goes for a long way. Airport runways are pretty short. Your two-lane highway goes for a long way, but you can't fit as much on it. Basically, it works on talk.
That's a pretty good analogy, I would say. You can't put as much information on the AM signal. It's amplitude modulation. So it is like a two-lane highway, but it can go further.
It goes forever sometimes.
Yeah, especially at night, with the way atmospheric conditions work with the AM signal, it can bounce off. And, there's legendary stories about a couple of stations, WLS out of Chicago, WWL out of New Orleans, were designated as clear channel. That was an FCC designation, which meant no one else could broadcast on that frequency in the same state or in some adjacent area. So you could hear WLS, across the United States or halfway, same out of New Orleans and the other stations as well. And there's something really special about that, hearing something from such a great distance. And there's also something special about the way humans interact with something that's only sound. Your mind creates extra imagery. Late at night, if you're driving cross country, listening to some AM late night talk show, you feel like that person's in the car with you, talking with you.
Yeah,
you feel a personal connection the way you do not with a blog or a TikTok or a cable channel. I'm sorry, you just don't feel that connection.
Yeah, I'm from Massachusetts originally, and I would at night listen to WBZ out of Boston, a clear channel station. Here, you could get it here in Ohio pretty clearly when the sun goes down. Because the way the technology works, when the sun goes down, other stations turn down their power. The clear channel stations do not. They blast all night long, and then it bounces off the atmosphere and back. And so that was the beauty of AM, and AM was the band. People forget that you listen to rock stations now and classic hits, iconic rock stations and classical music stations with the great sound, but all of that music used to be on AM back in the day.
AM developed first. The original pioneering operators for stations were on. They didn't even know it was the AM band because that was just the only band.
Yeah.
Yeah, FM was developed a little bit later. FM struggled financially for a long time. FM was around maybe even like late 30s. I should know, my radio history friends will jump on me, but it was around for a long time. It wasn't until the 70s or the 80s that it really took over. And now consumers have so many ways to consume media, podcasts and streaming, and there's just so many different options. It's understandable people like FM to listen to the music, but AM is still there. I like the fact that it travels so far, and the government likes it too. I mean, there's the National Public Warning System, which is designed for emergencies. It's going to stay transmitting even if there's an electrical power outage across the United States, hypothetically. This thing is going to still operate. So this is the backbone of like emergency alerts, which you need instant information in a time of crisis. AM is still the best way to do that. It's not a social media snippet on your cell phone. That's not the best way to reach the entire public.
Now, we're FM. We do the emergency alerts. I believe we issued one yesterday
right.
when the tornado warnings were issued.
I'm not surprised that FM and AM do it. But I think phasing out some older form of technology because it doesn't seem as glamorous is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like the industry, this is not like some conspiratorial commercial conspiracy. They want you to purchase things and buy things. They want you to have a subscription. They don't want you to consume media for free, even if it's ad supported. They want the subscriptions. So I think there's some of that thinking too, that people should not be listening to content for free. And then they also the belief that people won't pay for content that's really good. Well, public media proves that if you do good content, people care about it. We need more good content. So yeah, I think there's definitely a neat reason to keep radio.
We are talking about the future of the AM radio band here on 89.7 FM, ironically enough, with Noah Arceneaux. He's a radio historian and professor of media studies at San Diego State University. We would like to hear from you. What are your memories of AM radio? Perhaps you're listening to FM now. Do you still listen to AM radio? Do you remember AM radio back in the day? Give us a call, 614-292-8513. Again, our phone number is 614-292-8513. Ford, when it originally said that we're going to pull the AM radios out of the vehicles, mentioned that their data showed only 5% of the listening in their cars was to AM radio. Is it just this technology is fading away and people aren't using it? So why take up dashboard space with an AM radio?
I imagine it's not such a technical challenge to make AM radio work in an electric car. You were talking about the airport metaphor about FM being like an airport.
Yeah,
I've heard arguments from engineers for years that this idea that spectrum is scarce is a myth, that engineers could have figured this out a long time ago, and there's no reason to limit radio by the number of available frequencies. However, big stations, decades ago, like NBC, didn't want there to be 1,000 local stations. So they persuaded the government to go with this technology and this regulatory scheme that allowed dominant players to take over. Anyway, I'm getting off track. That was not your question. Your question was about the future of AM and if people are just phasing out of it. But I think we could have even more radio than we do. I think we need more voices, basically. And AM is still a very cheap, low-cost way for someone, maybe a minority group, a group that doesn't speak English. That's a good way for them to enter the public media space. And we cannot assume that everyone is going to have a giant, powerful FM transmitter. So even if it's only 5% of the people, you need to provide for those 5%. They may be the 5% who need that information the most, and they don't have the means to Wi-Fi stream the latest, music or something like that.
Yeah, in full disclosure, it should come as no surprise to anybody. I mean, of course, WOSU, our news product, began on AM. We were on 820 AM for many, many, many years, 80 years before we went to FM. And so we started on AM, and we don't, as radio broadcasters, really don't want to see, even though we're all on FM now, we don't want to see any kind of radio band taken off the car dashboard, because if AM goes now, then FM is next, right? So that's why the broadcasting stations like us really are watching this very closely, and the National Association of Broadcasters, our lobbying arm is fighting against this.
Well, I think the mobile companies have desired the broadcast spectrum for some time, that they could use it for 5G, 6G, hypothetically 7G. So I think, and if they started to use those frequencies, and the FCC continues with this argument of spectrum scarcity, they can say, sorry, FM, there's not enough room for you. The new kid on the block, hologram mine videos, whatever it is, 30 years from now, they're going to get the spectrum. And I think we need to preserve what exists because it's very low cost, very easy access. It reaches a lot of people. And the government does have some responsibility to make sure that correct factual information is provided to the public. I mean, the government, I think, does. The government makes sure the food you eat isn't going to make you sick. So I think that a similar analogy, not exactly the same way, I'm not saying we need to inspect everything, but I think there's a correlation to be made that the government has a responsibility to keep the public informed, healthy, and educated in every way.
Now, you can still get AM radio in your home radio, and on
most listening to radio is out of home
in your car.
And yeah, I saw some statistic from a few years ago. It was like 60% of people always had the radio on when they drove to work, and another 30% had it on sometimes. So I think, yes, AM could survive without being in cars, but that would be, terrible. It's like if you said you can still sell gum, but you can't sell it near the cash register. Gum sales are going to go down, right?
Yeah.
So I think it needs to be kept in cars and needs to be made available, and to ensure that, people can get, especially emergency information when they need it.
Yeah, I mean that's been what we have been keeping an eye on as radio professionals, is the dashboard. And that's the key. We have to be on the dashboard and easy to use on the dashboard. And we are, I have Apple CarPlay on my car, and I can easily access podcast and streaming audio from any station around the country. But it's quirky. And oftentimes, if I can't get the signal from a different source, I go right back to the radio. So, and as a radio person, I do a little jig in my car saying, see, radio is still relevant and radio is still important, and it is still the fallback for all of our listeners.
I like discovering unusual things on the radio. I'm in southern Louisiana right now researching radio stations down here, and there's still a couple stations that still broadcast in Louisiana French, which I think is really cool. They're AM. They may have a sister FM signal, but primarily they're AM, and it's just really cool to hear someone doing the rosary in French early in the morning. I mean, I've heard that.
Yeah, I mean, AM has kind of I started an AM radio in a station in Massachusetts that when I got there, Rush Limbaugh just started. And at that time, AM radio was struggling because FM was dominant in music. All the music stations were fading on AM, and Rush Limbaugh came in and is credited with saving AM radio. We could talk about that more in the next segment when we have another expert come on to talk about the culture of radio in the industry. But conservative talk is big on AM, thanks to Rush Limbaugh.
Yes, I've noticed that. My theory is that other kinds of arguments that require nuance or any kind of detail don't lend themselves to bombastic entertainment. That's my personal take on it. Mm-hmm. That, extreme points of view with a lot of caricatures or insults work well on the radio. It makes it some entertaining radio. But people unfortunately take that as being gospel truth, that when it's just commentary, really, it's not like factual news. Sometimes it's not even factual. But it works on the radio. It makes good entertainment. I admit I listen to AM radio, talk radio a lot of times, mm-hmm. just to hear what opinions are out there.
And it's not a recent trend. Father Coughlin back in the 30s and 40s was on AM radio.
Yes.
So
yes, very good.
Very controversial conservative commentator. So Rush Limbaugh was not the first, and these folks like Sean Hannity and Mark Levin are just following in those footsteps. We're talking about the future of the AM band, and will it still be on car dashboards? And we'll continue our conversation when All Sides continues here on 89.7 NPR News.
From an Iraq War cover-up to towns ravaged by opioids, to the roots of our modern immigration crisis, Embedded explores what's been sealed off and undisclosed. NPR's original investigative podcast reveals why these stories and the people behind them matter. Listen to the Embedded podcast, only from NPR.
This is All Sides from WOSU News. I'm your host, Mike Thompson. This hour, we're talking about AM radio. Yes, we're on FM, but we're talking about AM radio. WOSU News has its roots in AM, 820 AM back in the day. That's where I started here at WOSU. And still with us is Noah Arceneaux. He's a radio historian and professor of media studies at San Diego State University. And joining the conversation now is Bob Thompson, no relation, the founding director of the Blyer Center for Television and Popular Culture at Syracuse University, where he is also a professor at the Newhouse School of Public Communication, where I got my start in radio and TV many, many years ago when AM was really strong. Welcome to the show, Bob Thompson.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm a proud graduate of the Newhouse School of Public Communication, so it's good to talk to somebody. You came after I left, though. So anyway, Bob, you're a close student of the media landscape. Where does AM radio fit now, and where will it fit, say, 5 years from now?
Well, of course, AM radio was what radio was. That's what Jack Benny was on, and War of the Worlds, and Burns and Allen, and all of that kind of thing. So I suppose AM radio's first real challenge was when television came along. So AM radio's been fighting new technologies for a long time. I guess the big question now with the future of AM radio is being discussed as we speak, actual hearings and everything, now that several electric car manufacturers have decided not to put AM radio in their cars. And since AM radio, ever since the days of television, essentially, really became TV's prime time is in the evening. Of course, radio's prime time is drive time, when people are listening in their cars. 40% of radio listening is in automobiles. So the whole future of AM radio is being talked about. The big advantages of AM radio, the fact that it's got the opportunity for doing all this emergency information. Number two, that it's local news. And number three, that it serves underserved audiences. It's free and it can bounce off the atmosphere and get around corners and all that kind of stuff. Those are the three arguments for the maintaining of this very, very old, over 100-year-old technology and delivery system. On the other hand, if we listen to all of the advantages of AM radio that are being talked about in these hearings and why cars ought to be regulated, that they have to have AM radio, those reasons for AM radio are good ones, but I'm not sure AM radio over the past 20, maybe 25 years has been really doing their due diligence in fulfilling all the potential that AM radio.
Yeah, we were talking about, I started in AM radio in Massachusetts, and that's when Rush Limbaugh came on the scene. He's credited with saving AM radio by drawing in all those millions of listeners. But also at that time, that's when the FCC rules changed, and there was consolidation in the market. My local stations were bought up by corporations. They had the same owner for 50 years, and they've had dozens of owners since. Automation came in, and AM radio, and then the commercial load also increased. So it's more than just the signal that has hurt AM radio, right? Right, Bob Thompson?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and you're right when you say many people said that music, of course, rock and roll saved radio when television came along, and that Rush Limbaugh saved it back in the late 1980s. And from a business standpoint, I suppose that makes some degree of sense. Rush Limbaugh really did provide a whole new business model for how AM radio was going to survive. But with all the arguments we make of why AM radio needs to continue and needs to maybe even have regulations to continue, one of the big things was that AM radio was this bastion of local information. And it really was. I mean, they covered games and school boards and stuff that you'd never see on CNN or maybe even in your local paper. But that has really changed in all the ways that you just talked about. All that consolidation. There's some markets that Clear Channel owns. When they answer their phone and give all the call letters, it takes them half an hour to get through all the ones that they own in that market. let's take WSYR here in Syracuse, my big, powerful station that I can get for many miles away and all of that. It used to have all this local programming. It used to be very, very Syracuse oriented. If I turn that on right now, this minute, the Glenn Beck show is playing. And if I turn it on at night, it's Sean Hannity or Mark Levin or another show late at night called Coast to Coast. The title itself tells you that it is not local. The old notion that we're saying AM radio is so important because a lot of what we say after that because is stuff that AM radio in the age of consolidation has been doing, not in all stations, but in a lot of stations, a pretty poor job at.
Yeah, no, Arceneaux, we here in Columbus, WTVN still is a very, very strong station.
I would agree with much of what's been said, not 100%, but much of it. And I would agree that the potential that AM radio has not been realized. But I don't think that's a reason maybe against it. There is this idea that local radio and local TV stations will cover the local community. And I'm down in Louisiana right now. I've been to some pretty small towns. There are plenty of AM stations that still cover the football and still do all that stuff in these smaller markets, not even measured markets, not even outside Nielsen's markets. But anyway, if you switch to some new form of media, let's say Hulu or Netflix, right? I want to pick on them, but let's say Hulu, Netflix, they don't even have the semblance of a public interest mandate. There's no idea at all that Netflix would cover your local community. So while AM, I agree, AM hasn't been doing what it should be doing, if we replace it with something else, we're not going to get that local touch. We're not going to get it at all. So I'm firmly in favor of keeping all forms of radio, and even if it means a very crowded dial in the future, I don't want to see anyone go away.
We asked our callers to chime in.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think you are absolutely right. I think as we begin to have these hearings and all of this, where we look at the future of AM radio, we should not only, however, be asking the questions, should we mandate automobile owners or automobile manufacturers to put AM radios in their car, but we should start revisiting the question of the public interest. I think we should, the time to go back and look at what AM radio used to really be good at, and I agree with you entirely, it is uniquely positioned to do that any other medium is not as well positioned to do. And we should think about, maybe telling all the electric car vehicles to figure out, which they already have, how they can make AM radio work in their cars, but also to go back to some of those early days when we said that AM radio uses the public airwaves. We are the public. They're using our airwaves, and they need to therefore serve to some extent the public interest. By the way, I've been a guest on WTVN every Monday. It must be 25 years back when Bob, what was his name?
Bob Connors.
Alive and doing.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes.
And I try to talk about Columbus-related television as much as possible.
That's really cool. I love all that local history aspect. Just to throw in something, I've been visiting some local radio stations down Louisiana, see how the ones that broadcast in French. This was like something out of a movie or something. I was on one of these stations, KVPI in Ville Platte. I had an interview later in the day with another man, a record producer who did a lot of Cajun music. He wanted to change the time of the interview, couldn't find my phone number, heard me on the radio, and walked into the station. And they're like, Professor Arceneaux, he's here for you. And he shouts out at me, can we do it at 10, not 11?
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing. Like the whole town, it's like that sort of quintessential where even if you don't have the radio on, you're going to hear the radio because the windows are open. Ville Platte kind of feels like that to me.
All right, we're talking about the AM radio band here on 89.7 NPR News. Our guests are Noah Arceneaux. He's a radio historian and professor of media studies at San Diego State University, and also Bob Thompson, professor of TV radio and the founding director of Syracuse University's Center for Television and Popular Culture. We asked our listeners to share their memories of AM radio, and we will go to Ron on line 4. Ron, you're on the air? No, I guess we don't have Ron. Go ahead, Ron. You're on the air.
You asked for sharing any memories, and I'm up here in Wayne County, and Worcester had both AM and FM, and the AM played everything that the kids would listen to, whether it be rock and roll, whatever, blues, that type of thing, where the FM station was more something that played like the elevator music. And some of that was nice to listen to for a bit, but then you'd always go back to the AM. But the other thing about the AM is, like you've been saying, they cover things locally. They go down around to different churches. They cover the family. And, there's just all types of local things. I mean, more importantly, probably is in times of local disaster, the AM station was the one to go to. And then the other thing was, I used to work for the county extension office up here, and it was a great way for us to do educational series.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your call, Ron. Bob Thompson, this argument that only AM radio can do the emergency broadcasts. We are FM. We do the emergency broadcast. We did tornado warnings just yesterday when they were out in west of Columbus. What is the argument that AM is better than FM, or even better than the notifications we get on our phone as far as relaying emergency information to the American public?
Okay, well, I think, and Noah could correct me if I'm wrong about this, but part of it is that the infrastructure of delivering this information is set up so that I think there's 80 stations that are going to cover the entire country, and 60 of those happen to be AM stations. So that AM becomes kind of the first order of delivery of this information. And then, of course, it spreads all over the place. That's one of the arguments made. You are right, however, that whenever I've got my TV on, every now and again, I'll be watching something and that incredibly loud sound will come on, and it'll be a test of the emergency notification. And there are, of course, all kinds of other places that are delivering that. I think because AM radio was built into the early infrastructure of how that delivery worked, it's still considered part of the, in communications term, the first response. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the idea that AM radio can play fast and loose with the circular nature of this planet. A full-powered AM station can go a long way. I'm here in Syracuse, New York. I pick up WJR from Detroit at night sometime, pretty clear. WGN from Chicago, where I grew up, every now and again. So that's the other idea. The third, which we're hearing a lot in the testimony towards the auto manufacturers, is that when real disaster happens, the electricity's off, the Wi-Fi's down, your computer's not charged, you can always go to your car, turn it on, and listen to the radio. And their AM radio is going to be giving you that stuff. Now, that assumes that you have a car. I guess it assumes that you don't have a radio with batteries in it, which would be an easier solution. But those are the arguments we hear over and over and have been hearing in these recent comments in the attempt to keep AM radio at all costs in the automobile.
No, but if people aren't listening to AM radio in the first place, do those emergency alerts just like your tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it? I mean,
that is a good question. That is a good question. But I think there's a classic model of communication about you don't have to reach everyone, reach some people, the influencers, and they'll tell people. So I think it could work that way. If one person on the block is able to get valuable information, in God forbid, horrible time of disaster, they're going to tell everybody. That would be my argument in defense of AM radio. But I think the explanation of why AM functions better is, that's my understanding as well. And the AM signal doesn't carry as much information in terms of music. But if it's just like, hey, stay indoors for the next 48 hours or help is coming, it's going to come on Tuesday, whatever it is, that could be delivered very quickly, very efficiently on AM.
Robert, the bottom line is...
I will say that it's not that long ago. I live in a place where it snows 140 inches a year. And it hasn't been that long ago that the electricity has gone out, all the usual ways in which you get your information. And I have a battery radio, and we turned it on, and FM stations were still playing classical music, and NPR was playing its morning edition or whatever. And you still know here that in those circumstances, if you go to our big local AM station, they're going to be giving you school closings and all of that kind of thing. So that kind of thing in those situations is still functioning. And radio in general still is a place that when a lot of other of our more complicated ways of communicating and more sophisticated ways can potentially be down, radio is a technology that's fairly dependable. Now, if the Sharknado happens, I suppose everything is going to be down. But radio is a pretty good, is still a pretty good last-ditch place to go. And as we talked about before, the potential for wonderful local coverage, journalism, kids, sports, fun, amusement, local stuff. Nothing, I think, can do that as well as radio can. Now, most AM radio, of course, a good chunk of the stations are simulcasting on FM. So the distinction, except for the nature of the signal, is really getting to be a less and less significant.
But bottom line, Robert Thompson, should the government make auto manufacturers put it in their privately sold cars?
I think at this stage in the game, I think protecting any kind of, I mean, it's a complicated question because what you're essentially saying is automobiles are apps in many ways.
Yep.
You can now go to your phone and get the app for your local AM station. Some of these automobile manufacturers are saying, we don't want to provide this on our app. We're going to provide transportation. We're going to provide more environmentally friendly fuel, whatever. We're not going to provide AM radio. So it seems always strange. So what, we're going to make them provide this? But communications is always in a different category than anything else. It gets its own amendment. It gets its own indecency rules, all these kinds of things. And I think protecting any possibility that people have of getting important information that they need as citizens and as human beings is an important thing. So I suppose right now, if I were asked to vote, should AM radio be, continued in automobiles by some kind of regulation, my tendency would be to go toward yes.
And the bottom line is, if this stirs up enough interest in AM radio and they hear from rural folks from southern Louisiana, folks from upstate New York or central Ohio, the automakers will listen, right? And keep it in there to keep their customers happy.
I would be also in favor of keeping it in. I also, maybe take it one step a little further. I think the government has some obligation to make sure that every local community has news. There are some outlets, some small towns where there's no local radio, no newspaper, no nothing. You can, listen to whatever's on Google and, turn into Apple CarPlay, whatever that is. But if someone wanted to do something horrific, embezzle money, do something corrupt, there's no even hint of accountability. So now the mechanisms, how we make sure every community has local news, I don't know about the mechanisms. That's a complicated question, but I just think it would be a shame if we move to a world where everything is commercialized, everything is homogenized. You can get exactly what you want, but you can't get local news. That would be most unfortunate.
All right. Our thanks
to AM radio now is a perfect example. In most of the country, there are exceptions of an industry that has totally transformed into that single voice, over commercialized. When one looks at what all of these great AM radio stations across the country looked like 40 years ago and 30 years ago compared to what they are broadcasting today, they have certainly not been the place which has stood as the last stand of localness by any stretch of the imagination, with exceptions, I should always say.
Yeah, and that's where public radio has stepped in, and we have seen our listener growth. My thanks to Bob Thompson, professor of TV, radio, and film, and director of Syracuse University's Center for Television and Popular Culture. Bob, thanks very much for joining us here on All Sides, and also Noah Arceneaux, radio historian and professor of media studies at San Diego State University. Thanks for joining us. When we come back, we'll talk to a local radio, AM radio executive about what the future is for AM radio here in Central Ohio. When All Sides continues here on 89.7 NPR News.
From an Iraq War cover-up to towns ravaged by opioids to the roots of our modern immigration crisis, Embedded explores what's been sealed off and undisclosed. NPR's original investigative podcast reveals why these stories and the people behind them matter. Listen to the Embedded podcast, only from NPR.
This is All Sides from WOSU News. I am Mike Thompson. This hour we're talking about the future of AM radio. Yes, we're on FM, but we're going to talk about the future of the AM band. It's in the news because some automakers are taking the AM radios off of the car dashboards. Some electric automakers have taken it off, claiming that the systems of an electric car interferes with AM radio, so you can't hear it. Ford originally planned to take AM radio out of its cars, even the gas-powered cars, starting next year, but they have backed away from that after some protests from Congress, at least for the 2024 model year. They claim no one's listening to AM radio. Their surveys show that 5% of their data from their cars shows that only 5% of their listening was happening to AM radio in Ford cars. So that's what we're talking about this hour on All Sides. Our guest is Mike Island. He is a news anchor and reporter at Columbus's Black Information Network on 1230 AM.
Yes.
Mike, welcome to All Sides.
Thank you. And I'm so surprised that you asked me to come on this radio station to talk about AM radio, because I know nothing about AM radio. I thought AM radio was a radio you listen to in the morning. I wasn't sure. No, just kidding.
Yeah. So you have. It's funny. Mike brought in a letter from WOSU dated December 7th, 1966, where you were requesting a Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, and the music director at the time said, "We're going to play it for you." So
that was my first time getting my name on the radio, was on WOSU.
Yeah.
So you guys made me famous.
Interesting. We still get requests for various symphonies on our sister station, Classical 101. Mm-hmm. So tell us what the state of the industry is for AM radio here in Columbus.
Well, I feel kind of guilty because I was part of that FM movement in 1977. WTVN had an FM radio station that played the aforementioned elevator music, beautiful music format on 96.3. They wanted to make a change to radically alter the format to rock. And when we signed on the air February 14th, 1977 here in Columbus, that was seen as the start of the decline of AM radio around the country, because their music listening, of course, to FM is stereo.
Yes.
And all the rock records they heard in mono for years were heard for the first time in stereo on FM.
I remember those days. I remember my dad, 1970s Monte Carlo. He had 1973 or 1975 Monte Carlo, just had an AM radio. He went down to, I think, Radio Shack and bought the little FM receiver that he bolted to the bottom of our dashboard to get FM radio. And what does he play? He plays that beautiful music station that we could not stand. It really was elevator music. But as I got to high school into the 80s, the rock stations came on board, and we did not listen to AM anymore for music.
Yeah, even though AM radio has lessened in listenership over the years, and that's largely no fault of their own. It's their own FM components beat them.
Yeah.
So WTVN FM, which is now WLVQ, started to beat WTVN AM, which was the perennial number one in Columbus. And it went on from there, but WTVN, as you mentioned earlier, very strong.
Still strong.
Radio. Oh, yeah. It's an incredible radio station. And with the advent of the Black Information Network, the idea came in 2019. And radio economics, of course, slows things down a little bit. We were going to sign it on in 2019, and then in 2020, the George Floyd happened.
Yes.
And then one of our network representatives said, if we don't do it now, when? Mm-hmm. And so that's it came into being June 30th, 2020.
How large is your network?
It's about 44 markets on about 30 AM stations around the country, but it's also on FM and HD2. Mm-hmm. And if you ask me where AM radio was going from here, I'd say it's not going anywhere. it's going to have different platforms. I think HD2. I listen to WTVN on 93.3 HD2 here in Columbus. It's a split channel from a station known as 93.3 The Bus.
Yes.
And just go one up on the dial, and you've got WTVN in living stereo.
Yeah, same here. We have the RHD channels, 89.7 FM HD2.
That's how I listen.
Plays our classical station. And
Yeah.
that's how I listen to our classical
I grew up
station.
hearing classical, looking at the radio, seeing 89.7, and I relive that now just by 89.7 HD2.
Getting back to why AM radio is struggling and listening is down, is it because the sound quality isn't as good? It's that you can't fit as much stereo and high fidelity into it. You can't hear it when you go under a bridge. Or is it because the programming has become too national, too conservative? There are too many commercials on many AM stations. What do you think is the problem with AM?
Well, there are too many commercials on FM stations as well. But I think all of those that you mentioned, but I think probably the biggest one is that if you listen to radio stations, AM stations late at night, like I did, WLW, CKL, WBZ in Boston, I picked up here in Columbus, all these great radio stations, they had different local programs. And I got to know Philadelphia and places like Boston. I got to know those markets by listening to those stations. But a lot of them are simulcasting the same show all across the country. So the AM, what we call DXing back in the day, that's gone away. So I think it's the sameness of the programming.
Yeah, but you can do that now. I mean, I listen to sports radio stations from Boston through the app.
Yes.
I never could listen to the station over the air. BZ, you could listen from midnight to 4 a.m.
Yeah.
But you can listen to all these stations from all around the country right now through an app.
Yeah, but the bragging rights you had in picking those stations up, well, you picked it up on your radio, you installed your own antenna system, and you were able to pull it in. So it took a little work, but that was your bragging rights rather than just dialing it up on an app. So that was kind of fun. But you had to be a radio geek to really fully appreciate that. And I was a radio geek, and I respect those who listen to radio casually or normally.
Most people, when they get in their car, they got their coffee in one hand, their briefcase in the other. They're trying to get their kids off to the school bus. They're not worrying about,
fidelity. And
they want to just hit one button on their dashboard and hear what they want to hear. We in radio hope that they keep pushing the radio button.
Yeah.
But you can push a podcast button. You can push an app button just as easy.
My daughter listens to me 400. She's in Virginia. Leesburg, Virginia, and she listens to me 400 miles away every week. And I never thought that would happen unless I got a syndicated show. My first, by the way, I have to mention my first AM radio station was actually here at Ohio State, WOSR. We called it the Rock of State. It was on 540 AM, but it was carrier current. We had little antennas in different on dorm buildings around the campus. I think it started in Drackett Tower, moved to Drake Union, and it was there for many years. But that was the first AM radio station that I worked for, and I got to know the technology of it just a little bit.
Getting to the emergency and the localism, our previous guest talked about nothing can beat AM radio as far as localism goes, but those days are gone. I mean, really, I don't see them coming back. I mean, even your network, you're in 40 some odd markets, so in each one of those markets, they're not airing a real, truly local program. They're airing your programming. Yeah,
they're airing our programming. And what we did to localize those stations, we all have local breaks. I'm assigned local news here in Columbus on 1230. That's the only place you're hearing it on 12. The rest of the network, they're airing their local news from our anchors around the country. So we localize it that way, and we custom produce segments for those markets.
That's our strategy here. I mean, let's face it, most of our programming is coming from a national source, whether it be NPR or the BBC or Marketplace or other national providers. But we have a robust local news team here. We have 2 hours of local talk during the day, which we repeat in the evening. So we're trying to maintain the local, but it's expensive to maintain local.
It really is.
There's a lot of stations, especially when they're corporately owned, downturns came, advertising revenue dried up, and
we found out during 2020 how difficult it really was.
You also program hip hop R&B station Throwback 105.3, and you also work for 93.3 The Bus, a classic hits station.
Yeah, I get promoted, but I never quite get to totally jettison the job I had before. So I don't know whether that's an add-on or promotion.
Welcome to my world. That seems to be the media situation right now. But compare programming for those two stations. I mean, the two FM stations and your AM
If you
station.
put Throwback 105.3 and 93.3 together, and put those playlists together, those songs all played on one station in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s. That's the thrill about having both of those stations. I get all the music that I listened to in the 80s and 90s on those two stations.
But when you look at the FM, even the FM dial now, you look at the stations that are on there, they seem to be aimed at folks our age.
Yeah.
And classic rock, iconic rock, throwback, hip-hop, R&B.
Right.
The young folks are not listening to the radio. They're listening to Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music. That's how they're getting their music.
That's how they're getting the music that they like the most. They want to hear it in clusters. If you want to hear Tupac all day, you can do that. But if you want to hear a variety of music, and even I want to just listen to radio, I don't want to do any work. I don't want to dial up an app or push any buttons. I just want to turn on the radio and listen. If I want to hear hip-hop music from the 90s, I listen to Throwback 105.3. Classic hits from the 80s and 90s, 93.3 The Bus.
Is AM really, are they embracing sort of a niche audience, whether it be foreign language programming, programming aimed at diverse communities who cannot find a home on an FM station, perhaps rural stations?
Yeah, they're doing it without music, though. They're
Yes.
doing it with audio content, just like Black Information Network, aiming for a black audience, which probably doesn't get a lot of people who normally listen to music every day. They don't just turn to the Black Information Network for news. These are news junkies, and that's a friendly term, and they're after those markets, the Latino market, all those markets that FM stations go for music listeners. AM radio now goes for those who consume audio.
We're talking about the future of the AM band and what's going to happen here on 89.7 NPR News. Our guest is Michael Island, news anchor and reporter at Columbus's Black Information Network, here locally at 12:30 a.m. FM has gotten into talk. I mean, we're on FM. We're talking.
Yes.
Now, NPR's been on FM in most markets for a long time, but sports radio in this market is now its biggest listener is on FM. The games you never could get a sports game on FM back in the day. They were always on AM.
Right.
Whether it be the Guardians or the Reds or the Browns, the Bengals, always on AM, but now they're on FM.
Right.
So that FM is seeing the value in talk as well.
Yes, talk is rock. It's definitely rocking. And I think what's going to happen with AM radio, I think there's going to have to be more education on HD2 radio. I think these new cars you're talking about that don't want to have AM radio in it. Mm-hmm. I think education on what HD2 radio is. I mean, some people thought that you had to subscribe to it. Yeah. Some don't know. They say that it doesn't work. But they don't let it dissolve. You have to kind of let it sit there for a couple of seconds and then it kicks in.
If the car has it.
If the car has it.
But yeah.
Yeah, but we are aware that we can simulcast the AM radio stations on HD2, and we do that with the Black Information Network on a number of our AM stations around the country on iHeart.
Yeah, it's just it's a symbol of the ever crowded media landscape and trying to carve your little space. And,
yeah.
But 8-tracks went away, cassettes went away, AM. You don't think it's going to go that way?
I don't think it's going to go that way. I think it's going to be pretty much as is, and you might see music added on some AM stations because it's going to be simulcast in stereo on an HD2 station. So it wouldn't be too far off the mark for a station to want to go music, knowing that you can consume it on an app and that you can consume it on HD2 radio in your car or an FM station.
Yeah, it's just it's expensive to run that transmitter.
Yeah,
and
it really is,
and to maintain that transmitter and pay that electric bill for running that transmitter. So
right,
just
to think, I wanted to be a radio engineer. I wanted to climb the tower and change the lights and the wiring on the towers, but
you stayed close to the ground.
Right, my love of music tipped the scales in favor of programming. So
Mike Island, a news anchor and reporter at Columbus's Black Information Network on 12:30 a.m. Thanks for joining us here on 89.7 FM as we talked about the future of the AM band, really in the future of radio on the car dashboard. Thanks for listening to All Sides here on 89.7 NPR News. I'm Mike Thompson.